Hi everyone, welcome back. So the next phase of today's lecture is intended to try to familiarize you a bit better with some procedures to adopt when you encounter a large amount of data to try to analyze. So in this case, I have put together just a part of the nominal paradigms of 47 Turkish nouns. So at first glance, this looks like an enormous amount of data. And you might wonder, when you see so much data in front of you on the page, you may not be sure where you should even begin, how to start to try to find an analysis, what you are supposed to try to account for. Let's keep in mind our overall objectives are to, when we are faced with paradigms in this way, our main objectives are to account for allomorphy. So we are looking for stems or other morphological pieces that show more than one form. And we are trying to write or discover, let's say, phonological rules. So in principle, as phonologists, the second part is what we are more interested in. We are trying to see what phonological processes are at work in a language, but trying to account for allomorphy, as we discussed in the previous lecture, can play a major part in discovering those phonological processes. Okay, so when we're faced with this data, where do we begin? It's often reasonable to start by looking either horizontally across a row or vertically down a column to see if there are any patterns you can come up with and first steps you can make in analyzing the morphology. Since there are fewer different inflectional forms here than total stems, in this case, each row corresponds to a different nominal stem. I'll start by looking across and see if I can make any assumptions about the morphological status of this language. Since we've already looked at some Turkish data in an exercise session, some of this will look a bit familiar to you, and that may help us a little bit as we go forward. So if I look at the first row, it looks like I can probably make the assumption that the nominative corresponds to and is an isolation form of sorts. At least that's what it looks like in the first row. We seem to have additional suffixes added in the accusative, genitive, and dative. And if I look begin to look down one of the columns where I have the suffixes, I notice that the suffix is not always identical. We've dealt with this phenomenon a little bit in an exercise session, but we'll come back to dealing with that later. So looking across that first row, I could make the provisional, the initial assumed analysis of the morphology of these, that first word, that we have a suffix e, a suffix in, and a suffix a. It looks like we would draw a morpheme boundary after the labial stop. And there's a mistake there. There should, of course, be a suffix e in number 2. But looking through the first 8 rows, or 9 rows actually, the same morphological analysis appears to be valid. A suffix e in the accusative, in the genitive, and a in the dative. Now, if I look farther down the columns at this point, then I begin to find that, well, e, in, and a are not the only possibilities. For instance, I encounter u in the accusative, in the genitive, and a in the dative. And that indicates to me that there is more than one allomorph for these suffixes. And in the data that we're seeing here, these are the 2 possibilities that we want to account for. So at minimum, based on these suffixes, we can say that there are 2 phonological alternations that are interesting. So the accusative and the genitive show an alternation between the vowels and u, and the dative attests to an alternation a and a. And hopefully we can devise one or two phonological rules to explain these alternations. Now, so we'll start then by, since there are a lot more rows than there are columns, I will attempt first to account for the pattern of allomorphy and the patterns of phonological alternation that we have seen in these suffixes. So if we look at the environments of the inflectional suffixes, we'll notice the following patterns. So let's isolate our data for the moment to the cases that have E and A, and notice that there's also this pattern that E and A in suffixes occur together. So all of the forms, all of the rows where the accusative has the suffix E, the dative has A, and the genitive has E. But when the accusative has the suffix U, genitive has suffix un, then the dative has a. So there's a consistency and a relationship in the patterning. And when we try to look at the environments for these suffixes, I'll notice, okay, so in the first 9 rows, the next vowel to the left is always either A, as in hepi, hepe, kiki, kike. It's always either A or E. Those appear to be the only 2 options. When I move to cases where we have the suffixes u, un, and a, then the vowel in the stem is either a, as in hapu, or u itself, as in fusku, in row number 14. Those look to be the patterns, and describing those in terms of the phonological features of the vowels, we can say that when the last vowel of the stem is either A or E, namely when the last vowel of the stem is plus front, keeping in mind we can establish what the stem is probably by just looking at the nominative form, then the suffix allomorph has a front vowel. But when the last vowel of the stem has an u or a, namely when the vowel is plus back, then the suffix allomorph also has a back vowel. So there's a correspondence in the features front and back between the suffixes. So I would draw the conclusion from the Turkish data that the suffix, the vowel of the suffix, has to harmonize in frontness and backness with the last vowel of the stem. And we've seen something similar in an exercise a few weeks ago. So now we have the problem that trying to decide what the underlying representation of the inflectional suffix is not so clear, because contrary to the English case, the case with the English plural suffix that we discussed in week 4, none of these allomorphs really occurs elsewhere. There is a perfectly complementary distribution. So the perfectly complementary distribution says that when the stem final vowel is front, then the suffix vowel must be front. But when the stem final vowel is back, then similarly the suffix vowel must be plus back. So since we can't really decide what the underlying allomorph is going to be using the elsewhere principle, we'll try to write a rule that is able to correctly generate either allomorph from either underlying representation. That is, we want to say, assuming that the underlying form of the stem of the suffix could be either E or U. We want to make sure to have a rule that can derive either U from E or E from U. And what we'll notice here, you might notice if you take the time to examine the vowels internal to stems that have more than one vowel, that there's also agreement in terms of frontness and backness internal to a stem. So for instance, number 41, hebdil, we have two front vowels, but number 46, hadat, has two back vowels. So it seems that it's not possible to have a stem like dmap, where you have a front vowel in one syllable, but a back vowel in the other syllable. And based on these observations, we can write the following rule of backness harmony, which says that a vowel adopts the features, adopts the values of the features for back and front of the nearest vowel here. So it adopts the features back and front of the vowel immediately to its left. So this rule of backness harmony would say if we have the accusative singular suffix, if we put a stem like stem number 10 on the suffix e, it will derive the form with the suffix u. But if we put the stem found in row number 1, hey, this same rule will derive this suffix form e, because the suffix looks at the vowel immediately to its left. In this case, if the vowel is underlyingly front, it sees that the stem vowel is back, and so the suffix vowel correspondingly becomes back. And in the other case, if the underlying form of the suffix is back, it sees that the leftmost vowel of the stem is front, and therefore the suffix becomes plus front. So this works reasonably well. Now, this accounts for the alternation, this process of backness harmony accounts for the alternations that we see in the accusative and the genitive pretty straightforwardly. But we need to do something else about the dative. So the dative similarly has an alternation in frontness and backness, but there's not only a change in frontness and backness, but also a slight change in vowel height. We saw, I think, this alternation in an exercise a few weeks ago. There, I deliberately, on purpose, ignored the fact that there's a difference in vowel height between these two vowels in order to not have to discuss the problem at that time. But we'll talk about it a little now. So one thing that we notice in the data is that there are no stems that contain both plus low vowels and minus low vowels, but the dative can occur with the plus low vowel a on stems containing a vowel u. So for instance, let's take number 14 as an example. There the stem has only a single vowel, u, and it takes the suffix form a. It's interesting to see that in polysyllabic stems, stems with more than one syllable, we have cases like damat with two low vowels, and we have cases with simply u, but we don't have any mixing of a and u in a stem. In any case, one way of trying to account for this alternation would be to make the assumption that the underlying form of the dative suffix has the back allomorph, and then we can add a further condition to our harmony rule. So here I use these special, our conventions for writing rules use these additional angled brackets to show additional options in rules. So by adding the angled brackets to this rule, the rule now says that if the input to the rule is plus low, the output will be minus low, just in case the conditioning environment has the feature plus front. So a slightly unusual aspect of the way this rule is written is that the feature front is referred to twice in the structural description. And what we can assume, that is the environment of the rule. What we can assume here is that the more specific specification overrides the specification. It applies instead of the specification with the Greek letter that can mean either plus or minus. So we can imagine one version of the rule says a plus syllabic form, which is plus low, a low vowel becomes, yes, I have the Greek letters here, alpha back, either plus or minus back, and either plus or minus, and either plus or minus front, and necessarily minus low when it occurs in the context of a vowel in the preceding syllable, and which will be either, have some value for back and necessarily plus front. So the option plus front here simply overwrites, it sort of goes on top of beta front in this case. Now, if we use a derivation to show the effects of this overall vowel harmony rule, which then can account for both the alternations between E and U and A and A, then we can see that the dative form would be incorrectly predicted to have a vowel on stems with back vowels if we adopted the underlying form A. So let's just use these same two stems, pop and tape. Those are the stems in rows number 1 and 10. We consider our options here, given the way in which we've written our vowel harmony rule. So there, if the suffix is A, we correctly derive hepe for row number 1, and if we have underlying A, there, this rule, the input is plus low, and the output has to become minus low, in addition to changing its values on the features back and front, and so it becomes the vowel A in this case. If we assume A, on the other hand, on the input for the dative on a stem with a back suffix, then only the features back and front would be changed, but our rule as it's written would not change the feature low, and the output would contain this mid unrounded back vowel instead, which is incorrect. But if we have the back allomorph as the underlying form put onto a stem with a back vowel, then the correct dative form is derived. Of course, you could consider, I think it would be possible to simply reverse everything in the rule here and add the condition of that if we have a, no, actually this won't work. Forget what I was, let's ignore what I was just about to say. And we should consider that this analysis using a low vowel for the suffix of the dative is probably the only really viable analysis. Now, let's come to alternations in the form of the stem. So thus far, most of the forms of the stem, most of the stems that we've looked at, mentioned, don't seem to show any allomorphy. If we go down in the stems until we reach number 17 or 18, I think, the stem remains the same throughout the paradigm. That is in all inflected forms. The stem as we see it in the nominative is identical to what we find for the stem in the rest of the paradigm. When we arrive to 18, suddenly we see that there are some changes occurring. The nominative here has a voiceless ta, But as we morphologically segment 18 here into stem and suffix, the stem now in the other forms with the suffix has a voiced duh. So now we would need to systematically look at the data and try to find what the alternations are. So in rows 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22, we see an alternation in voicing. The same applies to 23. We have an affricate ch alternating with an affricate j, as well as in 24. In 25, we see a velar alternating in voicing, voiceless ka alternating with voiced ga in the rest of the paradigm. And that is all for the voicing alternations. When we arrive at row number 27, then we come to another further alternation. The nominative has a short, a non-geminate stop, hat, but in the other forms preceding the vowel initial suffixes, it has a geminate. So 27 has the forms hatu, hatun, and ha, and hatta. There, the long sign should be on the other side of the consonant. We should read hatta. And we find the same pattern with other obstruents. Haku, hakun, hakka, alternating with short hak. Afu, afun, afa, alternating with short af, and so on. And that happens not only with obstruents, but also with some sonorants. We have zammel, zammun, zamma, and sherri, sherrin, sherre, alternating with zam and sher, short consonants. And what's more, as we look at further data in 33 and 34, here we see the alternation both in voicing of the obstruent and in length of the consonant, and in length of the consonant as well. So both alternations can occur on the same stem. In the nominative, the stem final consonant is voiceless and short, but in the suffixed forms, it is long and voiced. So we have hat alternating with had, hadun, and had, and hadda. There's one last alternation in the data, which we first see beginning in row 41. So here in the, there we should read a long vowel, in the suffixed forms, the stem final vowel is long. So the vowel is to be read as tebdili, tebdilin. There we're missing the long sign, which should be present in the genitive. Should read tebdilin with a long e, and tebdile in the dative. And in 42, tejizi, tejizin, and tejize. And in 43, telifi, telifin, telife, with long vowels. And we can also find long a as well. So we have these three patterns of alternation in the form of the stem. There are stems that have voiced stops or affricates in suffix forms that alternate with voiceless stops or affricates. There are stems that have long or geminate consonants in suffix forms that alternate with short consonants in the nominative. And there are stems whose final vowel is long that alternate with a short vowel in the nominative. And in all of these patterns, it appears that the suffixed or pre-vocalic form allows for both options. So the nominative, we can find short stem final vowels and voiceless consonants preceding the suffix, and we can have both short and long consonants. So it's possible to have both short ta, as in atu, and long ta, as in hatu, like in 27. This, the fact that both options, voiced or voiceless, long or short consonant, long or short stem final vowel are possible in the suffixed forms should be interpreted as meaning that a neutralization is taking place in the nominative form at the right edge of the stem. So just as in German and in Russian, this word final context is providing an environment for a neutralization of some sounds. And this allows us to fairly easily write some other rules. So there is final devoicing of non-continuant sonorants. There is a shortening of consonants at the right edge of the word, and there is shortening of vowels preceding a consonant at the right edge of the word. So those are the three rules that will be able to account for these alternations. Devoicing of obstruents, degemination. Let me check one fact in the data. Yeah. Yes, I wanted to check. Row 36 provides an interesting and important data point because it shows that a fricative can be voiced word finally. So this is different from the devoicing that we find in German and Russian, where also fricatives are devoiced word finally. Compare in German the verb speisen, which has an underlying z, an underlying voiced fricative, which becomes voiceless as in the imperative speis. So in Turkish, this is a bit different. It appears that only the stops, as we see, for instance, in rows 18 and 19, and the affricates, as we see in rows 23 and 24, are subject to devoicing. This is why the word final devoicing rule in Russian, which apply the feature minus sonorant, will capture all stops, affricates, and fricatives. For Turkish, we have to make it a bit more specific and add the feature minus continuant so that the rule, the devoicing, will not apply to fricatives. So we can see our rule applying, three of these rules applying to the derivation under number 7. So this means that it's simply wherever we have seen any, just as we did for German and Russian, in this case, we can look at the suffixed forms to establish the underlying forms of the stem. This means that for the stem tedib, let's find that in the data. That's row 45, the word meaning punishment. This has a long E and a voiced ba in the suffixed form. So in its nominative form, without any suffixes, it will become, the word final stop will become devoiced, and the long vowel in the stem, E, will become shortened. If we assume, for instance, that the underlying form of the accusative suffix has a back vowel, vowel harmony would make it a front vowel. And as an example of the final degemination rule, in rule number 8, we can consider the stem had, which occurs in row number 33, a word meaning limit. And there, the suffix forms have voiced geminate stops, whereas the nominative has a voiceless short stop. So, but from the underlying voiced long da, it becomes devoiced to ta and shortened to a short ta. But in the corresponding accusative form, nothing happens in this case. And assuming in this case that the underlying form of the suffix is back, vowel harmony does not apply in this case either. So I would suggest you might take a moment at home to try to apply these rules to a few other examples in the data. When we return, we'll discuss some further problems in trying to decide the underlying form of stems when complex alternations occur in the data.